So my title is sort of grand. What I'm going to give you is much more modest, I would say. But I think it opens up some interesting ground to think about. It's something I've been working on now for quite a while, although not necessarily as a project as such. It sort of threads from various different pieces of projects that I'm pulling together here. I will underline something that is abundantly clear to scholars of Indigenous history and the history of Indigenous settler relations today. That is that the market worked and continues to work differently on reserves than elsewhere. Of course, we all know this. Many of you have doubtlessly encountered the argument of scholars and activists, perhaps most notably Tom Flanagan, according to which free markets, including, most critically in their view, the unfettered ability to buy and sell land, offer a solution to the appalling material conditions found on some contemporary First Nations reserves. For the record, I do not find this argument very persuasive, though that has little to do with what I will talk about today. I will focus on one community, the Wendat, or Huron village at Wendake, which used to be known as La Jeune Lorette. Admittedly, this is not at all among the reserves that spring to mind when we think about contemporary Indigenous poverty, and in fact, Wendake has a long history of living conditions that are on par with and that have sometimes clearly exceeded those of neighboring non-Indigenous communities. So here is where Wendake is situated, just outside of Quebec City. And here's an image from the 1860s of the village itself, from the river. The river is very important. The red building you see there is a paper mill. It would burn down 2 years later, and actually the same artist, Zachary Vincent, who's from the community, then painted another version of this with the building burning down from a different angle. It's kind of a fascinating double punch. But the paper mill was rebuilt. And as you'll be hearing today, this is a community that has been fairly well off for quite some time. In the background there with the red ensign flying is the chapel, which is one of the oldest buildings on the reserve. And in fact, if you go there today, you'll notice that Wendake is more dense than any other community right around it, and that has to do with the reserve. The fact that there is no extra land. They have to build dense if they want to build it all. So indeed, this comfort attracted some of Flanagan's bureaucratic and intellectual forebears to float the community as a candidate for forced enfranchisement in the 1910s. Yet this instance, as well as the socioeconomic and, yes, the business history of the reserve, demonstrate how critical the Indian Act of 1876 has been to the development of living conditions in the community and the ability of certain Wendat to expand their reach beyond the bounds of the reserve while consolidating both their political and economic power within it. A reserve economy is not the same as other economies, though the difference is not always easily predictable. There's no easy sort of equation that unites all reserve economies together, I would say. So if we were feeling particularly Foucauldian, we might refer to the historiography of Indigenous state relations in Canada as focusing on the norm rather than the deviant. That is, it's a very normative history. We like to look at laws, at legislation, and imagine that that legislation was put into practice everywhere, when in fact it wasn't. And that's one of the things I'm going to be touching on today. When we look at the ways in which, so the norm defined in legislation, especially in the Indian Act, has been translated to local conditions or not, really the deviant sometimes becomes more important. I think business and history, in particular, is helpful here, since it encourages us to look at practice, to consider how people actually produced goods and consumed them, generated capital and invested it, and structured relations with workers, investors, and consumers. Many of these activities and relations fell from 1867 under the auspices of the federal government and from 1876 under the Indian Act. And yet, as we will see, if such legislation might configure the discursive field in which policymakers, humanitarians, businessmen, and members of the public discussed Indigenous issues, it did not necessarily have any impact on the ways people bought, sold, and traded. Or at least it didn't necessarily have the impact we might imagine. In addition to signaling problems with this sort of normative history, the history that takes for granted the functioning of laws, whether these be adopted by Parliament or the supposedly more universal laws of economics or behavior. I want to underline how closely involved Wendake was in the socio-economic transformations that shook Canada during the 19th and early 20th centuries. No reserve is an island, and Wendake less than most, as seen by its close proximity to Quebec City. The community's elite had long had close ties with the upper rungs of the city's business and political class. At the same time, Wendake was and is a reserve, and as we will see, the Indian Act played a critical role in shaping business and social relations in the community at various points, although, again, not necessarily in easily predictable ways. So we'll consider a series of businesses owned and operated by Wendat in addition to allied economic activities, though that not businesses in the strictest sense supplied capital to Wendat commercial activity. These include the manufacture and sale of moccasins, snowshoes, and so-called tourist art, or fancy objects, sometimes they were called. Gigas is an older term that gets used. Allied work in tanneries, retail, lending money, and real estate. Together, these activities contributed to making material conditions in Wendake comfortable. They also contributed to an emerging class structure on the reserve, encouraged by business leaders using the levers of power offered by both elected and appointed politics in their own favor. So when I refer to quote-unquote market colonialism in the title of my talk, I am not referring then to some sort of an autonomous sector of human activity. I will not be holding to Polanyi today, describing how the economics subsumed the social. That's not where this is going, although we could have that conversation. Rather, I mean to suggest that the market, like among other things, the courts, schools, prisons, elected bodies, churches, and so on, the market is involved in the messy and overlapping set of power relations between settlers and Indigenous peoples, scholars term colonialism. So, the Wendat have long been involved in commerce. So as population in British North America grew dramatically from the early 19th century, the Wendat shifted their economic activity from a focus on hunting and trapping, complemented by a small amount of subsistence agriculture, towards the production and sale of moccasins, snowshoes, and other traditional objects. So here, a young British military officer has done these two renderings in the 1820s or 1830s of Indigenous peoples traveling or selling goods that they themselves have manufactured. Initially manufactured and sold by individual families, by the 1840s, the activity had come under the control of Marguerite Vincent, pictured here, and her husband Paul Picard, along with their son François-Xavier Picard, who's not up here, and their nephew Philippe Vincent, who is pictured, and his wife Henriette Romain, who I have been searching for years for a picture of and have not found. I have lots of information on her. She's a fascinating character, and I'd like to work more on her, especially since when her husband dies, she takes over the family business and runs it for a number of years. By all accounts, much better than he ever did. But so far, this is sort of remaining the dream, and it hasn't been realized yet. This was the first large-scale manufacturing business in the community. It was based on a putting-out system whereby Wendat produced goods in their homes. They sold their products locally to the British garrison and to civilians, while also promoting and selling it at industrial exhibitions in Quebec and Montreal, and at the Exposition Universelle in Paris in 1855. All of this activity was profitable. A mid-century visitor to Wendake claimed that Philippe Vincent, so pictured here, and Paul Picard, lived, quote, in comfort, nay, in luxury. Manufacturing did not provide the only source of profits, though. Indeed, at the same time that the Picard and Vincent family expanded the organized production and sale of moccasins, snowshoes, and other goods, they began a profitable push into local credit markets. Initially, they did this by lending funds at interest to non-Indigenous neighbors through contracts drawn up by notaries. So here's just the top of one of these contracts. This is a sale with the right of redemption. I'll be talking about this a little bit later. This is a particular type of contract whereby essentially the land is pawned. and this becomes very important from the end of the 19th century. In the mid-19th century, so these people are making money by lending money to non-Indigenous farmers who are settling the land around their village. So the Wendat are essentially underwriting colonization in this period. And they're making quite a bit of money doing so. In the absence of lending banks in the countryside, this provided both capital to those looking to expand their agricultural or artisanal operations while providing a relatively reliable form of investment for those with funds to lend. And this happens elsewhere too, not just in Lower Canada, but the French civil law in Lower Canada makes it much easier than what would be the case elsewhere. But in France, this is the case. This happens in Mexico as well. Though the Picard and Vincent did lend to Wendat on occasion, these loans were generally smaller and appear to have generated less interest, and in many cases actually generated no interest at all, had no interest payments, no interest fees involved. So this financial structure would change from the 1880s as a new family, the Bastien, took over both the provision of credit and manufacturing in Wendake. The changes to Wendat lending seem to have been driven both by increasing alternative sources of funds in the local economy. So the sort of shift, in order to invest money and to do so profitably, they had to seek out new markets, as it were. A new investment strategy on the part of the Bastians, and the changing legal framework within which such lending took place. Now most frequently involving community members alone, loans made in Wendake increasingly took the form of real estate sales with the right of redemptions. That's what I mentioned here, les ventes à faculté de rémunérer. So since title to this property changed hands with the sale, allowing the seller to repurchase by meeting certain conditions in a specified period of time, this generally involved reimbursing capital and paying interest. The creditor would no longer need to seek seizure in the case of unpaid debt. So this is, if you want to think about it, like the ultimate sort of secured loan. Because, in fact, you're giving money over, the creditor is providing money, but in exchange for property. This is property that the creditor doesn't actually want, but will keep if you fail to repay the loan in a timely manner. And that's what this sale is here. This is, initially the Bastians, what they did was they had people work for them. So this sale actually is not to be repaid in work, in money, it's to be repaid in work, a set number of hours each week in the company's business. Though not specifically designed for Indian Act era Canada, this method of effectively pawning real property fit the legal regime of reserves perfectly. From 1876 to 1930, the Indian Act declared that, quote, no person shall take any security or otherwise obtain any lien or charge, whether by mortgage, judgment, or otherwise, upon real or personal property of any Indian or non-treaty Indian within Canada. As this clause applied to all persons, it formally excluded Indigenous peoples from making use of lien in contracts among themselves. Since non-community members were simultaneously barred from acquiring occupancy rights to reserve lands, at least theoretically, because actually in Wendake, a whole slew of non-community members lived in the community for a very long time, and this is still an ongoing debate in certain communities across the country today. But anyways, we'll stick to theory here. Since non-community members were barred from acquiring occupancy rights to reserve lands or title to on-reserve buildings, those looking to use on-reserve real estate as a source of credit needed to sell their property with the right of redemption to other Wendat. As a result, the Bastians became, from the 1880s through at least the 1930s, the primary lender in Wendake. Moreover, they always seem to have turned a profit. Which makes sense here, right? They make a loan, then if you don't pay the loan back, they get the land, and then they can kind of decide what they're going to sell the land at, and they manage to take over quite a bit of the reserve as a result of this. At the same time, the Bastien family took up the position of primary manufacturer in the village. So here's some things that they would have manufactured. We have the kind of fancier, the picture of Alice Romain on the left. I have the feeling this is at something like a Universal Exposition Universelle, the word in English, the title is escaping me. Universal Exposition, exhibition, right? And then you have these sorts of fancy moccasins, so very high-quality moccasins that would not have been the kind of bottom of the barrel that were produced, and a picture of a man making snowshoes. Maurice Bastien founded the family business in 1876, known by the 1920s as Bastien Brothers, initially focusing on the production of snowshoes alone, and by the 1890s, the company had moved into tanning hides and making moccasins, with this latter product dominating its activities by the 1930s. Despite this upward trajectory, the family business experienced several downturns, especially the late 1880s through the mid-1890s, due in large part to Canadian competition in so-called Indian industries, including the manufacture of snowshoes and moccasins and the tanning of hides used for work. So there are a couple of people who either marry into the community. So there's a man named Cloutier who marries into Wendake, and another man named Henry Ross who acquires the Picard-Vincent family business in the 1890s. And these constitute the Wendat's primary competition in tanning as well as snowshoe and moccasin manufacture. While Ross moved off reserve to neighboring Loretteville, becoming one of several large, and so up there on the upper right, that's a little sticker from taken very recently from a snowshoe made by the Henry Ross Company, Henry Ross Limited. The internet is amazing for these things. There are people who want to know about everything, and so you can find quite a bit out there, including that. But the Bastians also expanded their operations shortly after this period. And they did so largely because of a boom in production and sales at the very end of the 1890s, caused by, of all things, the Klondike Gold Rush. Along with investment, and this helps to explain the business's ability to weather stiff competition. So in 1898, the Indian agent at Lorette claimed that, quote, there are manufactured in the Huron village no less than 7,000 pairs of snowshoes and at least 12,000 dozen pairs of moccasins. I don't know why he decides to call them 12,000 dozen pairs of moccasins. That just makes the kind of calculation hard. We're talking roughly 150,000, right, pairs of moccasins. And I think they would probably be about the sort that we see on the bottom, high top, not terribly high quality manufacture. But you can imagine 150,000 of these, or perhaps somewhat less, being shipped off to the Klondike, where people who are involved in the gold rush are putting them on their feet and walking around with them. And indeed, Bastien Brothers still exists today, and if you go to sort of the tourist shops across the country, you can find these. I think I bought my pair in Montreal, but I've seen them in Victoria, and I've been to their little shop they've got on the reserve as well. And of course, now you can get them online as well. And so this 12,000 dozen pairs of moccasins represented a general business of from $70,000 to $75,000. Sociologist Léon Gérin agreed at the time, estimating that the Wendat industry used 10,000 to 15,000 hides each year in the production of approximately 140,000 pairs of moccasins and 7,000 pairs of snowshoes. By this point, Bastien produced the largest quantity of snowshoes and moccasins, over half of the total value according to the Indian agent, with the Ross Company that had been purchased from Philippe Vincent's widow also manufacturing a fair amount. Though it floundered in the first decade of the 20th century, the industry had returned to relative health by the eve of the First World War, and after the war, Bastien Brothers continued its growth. According to a journalist writing in 1920, Wendat footwear sold well throughout Canada and in parts of the United States, noting that in Wendake, quote, one hears of 500,000 pairs of moccasins spoken of with equanimity. Another visitor to the village, the anthropologist Marius Barbeau, likewise noted manufacturing success following the end of the war. Quote, in the matter of local industries, Lorette is ahead of most Canadian villages. and the demand for the manufactured goods, moccasins, snowshoes, gloves, toys and curios, leather baskets, etc., is heavier than the supply. To understand what I have termed market colonialism in Wendake, we also need to be aware of changes to both another key business sector on the reserve, that is retail, and to the state's governance structure. Through the mid-20th century, and so this is another thing that's sort of particular about Wendake, but through the mid-20th century, Indian agents provided the Department of Indian Affairs with its eyes and ears on reserves across the country. In Wendake, this position was always held by a community member, by a Wendat, and this is quite unusual. A community member who, with the exception of only a few years in the early 20th century, was always also a Bastien, was always also a member of the Bastien family. At the same time, and though the Indian Act specifically forbade agents from trading with their wards, a Bastien agent often ran a general store in Wendake. This was the case, for example, with Antoine Oscar Bastien, so pictured there on the right with the coat and the medal around his neck, who sold groceries to other community members from 1894 until he was ordered to stop by the department in 1900 when it became aware of his practice. And so this points to what I mean by sort of we need to get away from normative history, because in fact, as the agent, he was also supplying relief from his store. And so he would send in receipts to Ottawa on his store, his company letterhead, that he himself signed. So it said Antoine Bastien, a grocer, and then he would sign at the bottom, Antoine Bastien, Indian agent. And this is in clear contravention of the Indian Act, and yet no one ever seemed to notice until a few community members got counsel and threatened to sue the Indian Department because they said basically he can't give us credit, so he can't demand reimbursement of our debt. The Indian Act protects us from this. So they stopped him from doing this in 1900, but the same thing pops up again in the 1920s when Luger, so he is way over, let's see if I can get this. This is Luger Bastien, and Maurice E. Bastien, and I don't think he's actually on this picture. Yeah, there are so many Maurice Bastiens. This is his father. Their father. But Maurice E. Bastien is not on this picture. In fact, there are multiple generations of Maurice Bastien, at least three. This is their father, and his father actually was the one who started the company. So they ran a grocery store from the 1920s in the community. And like Antoine before him, Maurice E. was the Indian agent, and his brother, Luger, here, who had been a conservative, the first Indigenous MLA in Quebec from 1924 to 1927, was the Wendat chief. So here you have the highest elected official on the reserve and the highest civil servant on the reserve running a business that is technically illegal under the Indian Act, right? And these positions of political authority certainly did not stop the family from turning a tidy profit, redeeming federal relief vouchers at the family store when the Depression hit, and led the Bastiens to lay off almost their entire workforce. This led to dramatic increases in relief as the federal government recognized that Wendake held no job prospects. And indeed, throughout the 1920s, the Indian Affairs did not distribute any relief on reserve. This happens in the 1930s. It spikes because of the Depression. According to a reserve resident, quote, a girl working periodically in a slippers factory in Lorette in the mid-1930s could expect to earn, quote, just a few dollars a week while remaining without work at frequent intervals. Though two other Wendat ran grocery stores, both of which sold the staples that relief vouchers could purchase at a lower price than the Bastien store, neither received anything like the number of vouchers paid to the Bastiens. In the hopes of returning to work, former employees sought to remain in the family's good graces by handing in their relief vouchers, even if this meant significant loss in purchasing power in the short term. The Bastiens, after the Depression, rebounded, They used funds provided by the department under a handicraft program in the Second World War to import Italian and Czechoslovakian beads to make their moccasins. But they never employed anything like the number of people they had in the past because of mechanization and other reasons. But as I mentioned, the company is still around today. So to wrap up, and I'm actually filling, I'm like a liquid. I can fill the space you give me. So actually, I'm going to manage to get to that 30 minutes that you mentioned, I think. I would like to do something that probably most presenters would get out of the way at the beginning. I would like to briefly discuss methodology and sources. Doing so, I think, makes obvious why I have concentrated today on Wendake. Though in many respects a comfortable village on the outskirts of a major population center like any other, Wendake has also, since almost the very moment the Wendat first established the village at the turn of the 18th century, been an important destination for visiting scholars, dignitaries, and tourists, along with members of Quebec City's socioeconomic elite. Many of these people recorded their impressions of Wendake in the form of travel narratives, learned tracts, and tourist guides. Over the period covered, Wendat issues also regularly appeared in print in Quebec's major newspapers, whether in the form of a multi-part biography of François-Xavier Picard, for example, who's pictured here, or in letters to editor detailing disputes over the provision of relief in the 1930s between the Bastien brothers and competing grocers from the village. We see regular traces of Wendat enterprise in the reports of credit rating agencies like Dunn and Wyman, and the community generated a massive archive of notarial records, of which I've really only begun to scratch the surface, and this is something that I'm working on going forward. And finally, ethnographers, whether employed by the Department of Indian Affairs in the hopes of making the case for forced enfranchisement, or working independently in the academy, produced several important studies of village life from the end of the 19th century. In addition to all of these images I've been showing you, artists are attracted to this, and we have quite a lot of photographic material as well. So I have found nothing resembling this incredible documentary richness in my work on business in other First Nations communities in Quebec situated further from Euro-Canadian centers of population. This explains in part why I focus on a relatively comfortable village. Another reason tied to the first is quite simply that because of this varied corpus of sources, it is quite apparent that the Wendat indeed practiced business. Because this is often a sticking point, right? When we're looking at sort of cultural histories of marginalized groups and using a term originating from dominant society, it's sometimes difficult to actually say this is business, right? Well, what these men and women were doing is quite clearly business. They were running family businesses. It's hard to make it fit into established narratives and patterns. In Wendake, we encounter family firms that are recognizable in the context of the broader historiography on business in ways that are not necessarily the case in other communities. And finally, Wendake is a useful site for considering market colonialism because of the important role the state and legislation played in shaping and not business practice. Though the Indian Act was not always and perhaps was not often directly implemented, its clauses shaped Wendat's strategy and practice. This included the 1930s, when Indian Affairs and the Bastien family simply decided to ignore the Indian Act. Letters to the editor of Le Soleil, so Le Soleil, the liberal newspaper in Quebec City, and the Bastiens were conservative, so this might have something to do with it. One of the most widely read dailies in Quebec, detailing clear improprieties, had no effect. By then, Canadians had come to understand that Indigenous peoples, whose affairs were increasingly managed by a federal department with which mainstream society had no relationship, under a law that applied only to First Nations, existed in a separate space, the Reserve, that had very little to do with Canada as they knew it. Thank you.